Far too many people suffer while dying and then die alone. For me, unless this is a choice, this country has moved way too far away from supporting people in this inevitable human event. This is Gynocurious. I am your host, Dr. Amy Novat. We are here to investigate what it means to be a healer and to be healed. Please let us know your thoughts and concerns by sending us your comments at radiofreerhiniecliff.org or to gynocurious@gmail.com. Please, when you listen to us, if you like what we're saying, rate us, star us, share the episode so that others can be part of our community of learning on Gynocurious. So today I want to welcome Karen Bellone. She is a visual artist and storyteller who is a certified end-of-life doula and educator and the founder of the Seventh Sense Care Collective. Welcome, Karen.
Hi, Amy.
It's so nice to have you here.
It's great to be here.
So I would imagine there are people out there listening saying, why is Amy talking about death? Why did she invite an end-of-life doula to her show? Because what I've mostly focused on is way of being healthy and living our lives. But for me, the gift of being with someone when they're dying and watching someone go through death has been one of the greatest, most profound experiences of my life, personally and professionally. And we've moved so far away from incorporating a ritual around death and dying in this country that I just felt it was imperative to have you here to embrace the work that you're doing and to let people know more about it. So if you would you just kind of start with, what is an end-of-life doula, and how did you get into this work?
Well, the word doula is a Greek word, and from my understanding, it really speaks to women helping women. And it has come to be known as work that is not medical, but spiritual, emotional, and psychological, the whole well-being of a person. And there are many different types of doulas, obviously, birth doulas, death doulas like myself, transitional doulas. And I think this is probably something we as humans naturally did for one another in a different time. Now we're remembering these rituals, as you said so aptly, these skills, these gifts that we all possess to bear witness to one another and to aid one another, to accompany one another. We see this in the animal world as well. So I think it's a very natural part of our being, but we have been pushed away from this memory and this understanding of ourselves and our gifts to share with one another, just as many things within the medical world have changed. So obviously has death and dying.
Yeah. Was there a personal event that kind of catapulted you or inspired you to do the work?
Well, I would say a few things. One is that I've always had a very deep relationship to spirit since I'm a very young child. And I think like many children, or maybe all children, our understanding or feelings about death are maybe not as scary as they may seem for some adults. And I think we're curious more so than fearful. We learn to become fearful. So as I moved through my life, I, of course, lost my relationship to spirit as I developed into my teens and early 20s in a way, because modern culture just beats it out of you on a certain level.
Yeah.
I was doing my master's through the Actors Studio as a director. And some of that work, working with affective memory, emotional memory, the sensory work, really grounding within the body and understanding the essence of myself as a human from my body's knowledge, awakened something in me that really rekindled an understanding of of my own humanity. And so later in my life, I was really looking for something to engage in terms of meaningful work. And I was really just called to the death work. At the time that I first studied, which is about 10 years ago now, it was a very small subculture in this country. And it has grown enormously, exponentially since then. So,
Yeah. I want to tap into something that you mentioned. You talked about how at another time, I think in the human experience, death was much more a part of kind of everyday life. And I was thinking of you as a visual artist and how I was just recollecting going to museums, and realizing that there are so many paintings, for example, of the deathbed. And recently learned that death paintings or paintings about death are actually a category unto themselves. And it's interesting because when I think about more modern art, you don't see death and dying depicted in the same way, or maybe I'm just not seeing it. But I wondered whether, as an artist, whether this is true, and does the work of your art inform you about being a doula, or doula impact art? And, why don't we see more modern art depicting death and dying? Is that speaking to how far we've gotten from it? That was a lot of questions.
I love the questions. I think we have gotten away from it. I think, for me personally, yes. My relationship between art and death is very close at hand and very palpable. To me, I think of them as one and the same in a way, because I don't know that all artists would agree with this, of course. But for me, I feel that whether we're conscious of it or not, art is a spiritual underpinning of how we keep ourselves in good stead on this planet. I think it's part of the work that artists do in a very unconscious way, because you are connecting with your intuition and with, in some way, your existence and your humanity, and you're reflecting it back in ways that others can empathize, feel, take on emotional content that maybe they weren't engaged with until they were brought to that painting or that piece of music or that dance performance. It moves us in ways that the intellectual mind cannot. About 100 years ago, or maybe, closer to 150 years now, death became medicalized. And really, I do think that was a moment that changed everything, because people would die at home, which I think to this day, that is what most people say they would like. And the medical profession essentially took that away from us and continues to. As you mentioned, art has a history of depicting death, and even in the start of photography, their death portraiture was a very big thing, because it was a way for us to hold on to the memory, to the physical memory of someone we loved.
Were these actually images of someone on their deathbed?
Usually right after,
Interesting.
Deathbed portraits once a person was dead. And prior to that, paintings were done of people, sometimes by the nurse who might be caring for you. I mean, it was just, death is not separate from our lives. It is part of our existence, and it gives our existence meaning.
Speak more about that, if you would, please. Unpack that for us.
Well, if we lived forever, what would that be? Right? So in the cyclical nature of existence, which, if we look to nature to teach us, and we look to the animals to teach us, we can rekindle the things we have lost and forgotten about what is the true essence of our humanity, which is to acknowledge and embrace that there is an end to this physical life. Anything else we cannot know. It's engaging with that mystery. accepting that there are things we cannot know, that is humbling, as is death. And perhaps we need a little of that humility to help us to live our lives more authentically as well.
Yeah. I just thought of the most ridiculous analogy. I don't know, maybe because I'm sitting in this wonderful store called the Epicurean in Rhiniecliff, New York, where I'm surrounded by all these delicious foods. But it struck me on a kind of a biological level, and bear with me. It's hard to describe salty, the flavor of salt, if you can't contrast with sweet, if you can't contrast with umami, that these flavors, these ways of tasting our food are in contrast with one another, right? And there's something about what you're saying about life and death, that if you don't acknowledge death, if you just put it out of your mind and I don't know, let fear overwhelm you and
deny it.
Deny it, exactly. Then in a way you can't look at life in the most embracing, full, honest way. I know it's a very silly analogy, but it's compare and contrast that so often teaches us in our lives. And so I just had to say it out loud.
Having been present for both birth and death,
yeah,
I can tell you that my feeling is that these moments of transition in our existence are not dissimilar. The same sort of liminal space opens up for us to receive new life and for us to let go of life. And if we concentrate on allowing that to trickle down for us in our consciousness, because it's not, today I've made the decision that I'm fine with dying. No, it's a mindfulness practice of sorts.
That's right. That's right.
And it's attached to many other things. I think the compare and contrast idea is correct, but it's also, we live in this dualistic construct as well. So we think of birth good, death bad. But actually, if you think about life as a circle, they are one and the same. They will come back to one another. And that is the sum story of each of our individual existences. And focusing and concentrating on that and the non-duality aspect of that, it starts to trickle down into your living. And then death becomes the meaningful piece that we can unwind from backwards in a way while we're alive and think about, wow, I'm present in this moment. I feel this. I smell this. I hear this. I touch this. And all the things that we know should affect us in the way that we are deeply joyful about or deeply sad about, we allow ourselves to feel those things.
Yeah.
And know that that's the gift of this mortal being, this vessel we inhabit during this lifetime. None of us can know what the sum total of life is, what consciousness is, but we do know we have this physical body, and this physical body has a termination date. And as hard as we fight against that in modern culture, at this point, we can't undo that. And I certainly hope we don't.
So you mentioned the impact of the medical system on death and dying. I agree with you. There were so many changes when the AMA came to be and all of the power that they wanted to hold over all aspects of childbirth, illness, death and dying, for example. But I think there's more reasons, and I'd like to have us talk about why have people moved so far away from talking about death, being with dying persons. What do you think that's about? I mean, is it simply the fear mongering around it?
I think fear-mongering is a huge piece of the puzzle. I also think that doctors do not want to speak to people about terminal illness necessarily either in a very honest way. And I don't think that we are being given the tools to be able to open up to this in a way that would be healthy for us on all levels. And also, you know, palliative care physicians do understand that there is another way to walk the path when you're ill, even if it's not, you know, necessarily imminent death, but that to treat the whole person, the well-being of the whole person, and also we can't forget how we also fit into the construct of our families or our circle of loved ones. Because when a person is dying, it's not just the dying person's reality that comes into play. It is the fabric of that entire life and the people that care for, love that person, and will become, more than likely, the caregivers. So I do feel that the medical profession is undermining us as their patients and not giving us the proper tools to begin these conversations.
Yeah.
Hospice is a wonderful movement in this country and throughout the world, but unfortunately people don't understand hospice because hospice is not spoken necessarily about in a comprehensive and clear way either. And maybe the doctors sometimes don't even understand themselves. You know,
I think that's very true. Again, you know, you were speaking about the, you know, the absolute nature of the binary, life, death, black, white, etc. And in some ways, hospice has been peripheralized as, oh, it's only about death, where in fact their role, their value is in the dying process. And remember, folks out there, you know, dying can take 6 months. It can take longer than that. We're not talking about just the last few days of life. And so I wonder, do end-of-life doulas ever work in a hospital setting?
Yes, of course. Doulas work wherever a person lives, where their bed may be. And, you know, part of what doulas help people to do is to have choices. Embrace that you get to die the way you want to. On some level.
What if somebody says, I don't know how I want to die. I just feel like I need to talk about it. How might you respond to that question? Because not everyone has they don't even have the language.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, if we're lucky enough to engage with somebody at the beginning of their path, then we can accompany them all the way through. So, of course, there's no absolutes in anything, and there's no decisions to be made by the doula. The doula is there to provide information, to provide care, to provide choices, and to, at times, be the conduit to bring the circle of loved ones together with the dying person in a way that aids the person to communicate, to get what they need, to think about what they might want. And sometimes it's none of these things. It's whatever happens once you sit down to accompany someone who is beginning their journey towards death. And this, until you're in it, is not necessarily something we can know about. But we, at the Seventh Sense, we have compiled what we call Deathbed Wishes Compassionate Care Booklet, which is very comprehensive and helps people to think about how they might want to walk this path, accompanied by a doula and by the people that love them. And what does that mean? It means you get to tell your story. You get to talk about who you want to be with you, how you want your bed to be oriented in the room, what you want around you, what rituals you might engage in. Do you want people to take their shoes off before they come in the room? It can be anything, because we spend our lives dealing with issues of control. And very often, because we wait to have these conversations until probably way too late, we lose control. And then we also leave the people who love us guessing and trying to figure out what it is we can do to really be taking care of the people we love. So it benefits everybody to start these conversations. And with our booklet, we are thinking to hold some dinners. So we're sitting around having a wonderful meal, and then we sit together and talk about how we might approach some of the pages of this book. So I think the medical profession, unfortunately, the palliative care movement seems to not be getting that much traction. I think maybe because, as you said, the medical profession is really monetized in a way that perhaps palliative care is not getting the footing. But when I first started training as a doula and I was volunteering in hospice, I really did see that there's an alliance between palliative care medicine and the doula movement, because they both are about addressing the here and now with where you're at and addressing the whole being, as opposed to segmenting it out to you're dying and now you could potentially go on hospice. And then nobody explains to somebody who's given the terminal diagnosis at times what hospice means. So you don't understand the care that can come to aid you and also aid your family and loved ones, so that it doesn't become too much of a burden for them as well. I mean, the more we address talking about this, both in the healthcare world and within our families and our communities, the more we understand that this is part of community care. This is part of how we take care of one another. Just like we would bring food over for a new family, we want to think that way about being in community with death care.
Yeah. You've mentioned several things that I just want to kind of reiterate, because I think they're just so important. One, the issue of control, and that for so many people, death feels like the absolute loss of control. And yet what I have experienced, just like you've described, is when someone has, in a way, orchestrated, or I love the idea of when you started as an actor and a director, that you're giving people direction and scripts in which to ground them in what might be an unexpected event on stage, or an unexpected event when one feels really well and all of a sudden one is being told they have a terminal illness. That the idea of control has a lot of meanings. It's nuanced, but anything that we can do as human beings, knowing, hey, we are all going to die, anything we can do to help eradicate the fear, bring some level of orchestration, communication, humanity to the experience, it's so helpful. And speaking a little bit about palliative care and doulas, physicians are trained to promote life. And it becomes this way of looking at the world that is almost, how shall I put this? It doesn't allow physicians to remember, oh yeah, then there's death. So they just are on this path of, I'm going to promote life, promote life, promote life. And we know in this country in particular, we spend an enormous amount of money the last 6 weeks of people's lives. It's often for naught. It's not really promoting anything but pain and suffering, but it's keeping someone alive. And there's just so little opportunity for physicians to really just talk about letting go, honoring the inevitable. And then, of course, we live in a country that is so driven by pharmaceuticals. And we have a lot of pharmaceuticals that help promote life, but not necessarily deter death. So it's confusing for a lot of my colleagues. I'm not condoning it. I think that from day one in medical school, we should be having courses on death and dying. And when I think about my own experience as a clinician, no one ever talked to me about how hard it is to watch someone to die or to let go. It's remarkable. It's just remarkable. And so I'm going to say it out loud, like I say a lot of things out loud in Gynocurious. The education, as you pointed out, is so much a part of whether it's being a physician, whether it's being in a family, whether it's being in a community. The more we learn, the more we talk, the more we put out there, it's so, so important. So I want to ask you about the seventh sense, Can you talk about that?
The name itself?
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
What's the seventh sense?
what do you think it is?
There's a lot of things I could put in that liminal space, as you put it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I do think that we call the sixth sense intuition, right? Mm-hmm. So what is intuition? Mm. And what comes past intuition then? What would be the seventh sense? Maybe the synergistic sum of all of those parts of the five senses we list and know, but don't think about very much, right? Engaging with that, so those feed us to tap in more to our intuition. So maybe the seventh sense for me, it has a lot of meanings, but I think I chose it as the name. Excuse me. I chose it as the name of our care collective because for me, it is the body's remembering how to die. Because I think that this is actually a moment of transcendence. And maybe there's incredible beauty in it as well. And that's something to concentrate on. I just want to go back to the issue of control, because as you were speaking, I was thinking about how in our day-to-day lives, we look to have control because it assuages our fears.
That's right. That's right.
And our anxieties. Mm-hmm. And I believe it's the same when we want to think about approaching, having a relationship to our own death. The idea of having control is to assuage the fear.
Yeah.
It's not to say we're not going to have fear.
That's right.
I had fear when I gave birth. I was also in the most elated state I've ever experienced. We can hold these things simultaneously.
That's right.
And so if we push off learning, opening the window to having a dialogue with ourselves about mortality, we're just pushing this conversation off, but it's going to happen anyway. So wouldn't we rather not have as much fear as we might have? Wouldn't we rather make some choices both for ourselves and for the people we love? The last thing I want to say about that is how it impacts our grieving.
Yes.
Because, people will talk about the phrase, a good death, which is not my favorite phrase necessarily, but it does signify something in the sense that it lets us know that, there could be a bad death versus a good death. So what is a good death, right? So what is a good death? What does that mean to each one of us? Just to ponder that. Oh, I don't even get that. Okay, that's a place to start too. What could be good about death? What could be good about death?
Oh, I think that's such an important question. Such an important question. Yeah. It's funny. I had this question for you and it just went in and out of my brain because I was envisioning the answer to that question. And it's such a subjective experience and so reminds me of how individual we are in terms of what we see as kind of the light and the shadow of our lives and the good and the bad of our lives and the way in which we experience our lives. And yet there's something, even though it's individual, part of what you've been talking about, and you've called it spirit, but it's also kind of like the collective unconscious. Jung talked about this phenomenon, and I think I believe in it. I trust it. I know that it's part of what motivates me as an individual and certainly the collective. But it's also, I think it's around the deathbed. I think it's around how we choose to either push death off in our mind or embrace it. And I wonder where religiosity comes in around all of this. So were you raised in a religious home?
I was born and raised as a Catholic as a young child, and I did very much love the Mass. When I was very young, I used to go to church with my grandmother, but Catholicism is not necessarily the religion that continued to speak to me, but the ritual and the sacred geometry of it all was very engaging to me as a young child. So, religion, it's such a deep topic, and I would rather speak to the collective unconscious aspect of what you're bringing up, because yes, I do experience that and speak of that in terms of spirit, but I also do believe of it as the collective unconscious as well. And, we cannot know what will happen to us, whatever we are, after we shed this mortal coil, but pondering it is a wonderful part of our existence while we're mortal. I think it, like art, it allows us to transcend the mundane and the intellectual, which I don't necessarily think is the best serving us when it comes to communing with our humanity. So death becomes a great leveler. So is birth. These are the same types of transitions in our existence. And as we celebrate birth, we should celebrate death. That is really the philosophy, I think. And that allows us to acknowledge that there is a collective unconscious. What it is, we can't know. But we can believe. And I think that's the basis of religion as well, is a belief system that there is something greater than this mortal existence. And the best part of religion, to my mind, is that it gives us that context to live our lives with a higher calling. The thing about religion that I don't like is that it takes it away from our individual existence. I like to think of nature as God. Every lesson that we need to understand about our own nature, we can glean from looking at nature. It's all there for us. And there's a lot of comfort. You had said to me earlier, prior to the recording, the idea of being in nature when you're dying. I think this is something that at the Seventh Sense is part of our mission, is to have a home for the dying so that people can come and be immersed. We just planted some hawthorn trees because they are very medicinal, but also because they have an attachment to grief. So we're looking at it as a sanctuary that will over time grow and become a place for people to go and have a respite if they're caring for someone they love in the home. This is community activism at its best, and I think it's a way for us to bring death back home, which is really where it belongs. And all of the things that we've talked about around that are, I think, the education we need to do for ourselves, with ourselves, individually and within community, within families.
Right, right. So if somebody out there is thinking about hiring an end-of-life doula, how do they go about doing that?
Well, you can just Google end-of-life doula near me. Certain things will come up for you now. I mean, that's different than 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. There are two organizations nationally, the National End-of-Life Doula Association and the International End-of-Life Doula Association. And they both have directories by state where you can look up end-of-life doulas that may be available to work with you. Also through the NHPCO, the National Health and Palliative Care Association, I believe it stands for, or organization. Mm-hmm. They also are trying to quantify and qualify the doula movement on a national level to help people to know how to access finding someone. A lot of it is word of mouth. There's been an enormous amount of press over the last few years about the doula movement. So I think more people are becoming aware. But we are engaging with a lot of community events right here locally, and people can contact us directly at theseventhsense.org if they would like to know more.
Yeah, great, great. It just struck me that years ago, I mean, I'm talking about maybe 20, 25 years ago, there was some science in the obstetrical literature demonstrating that doulas in birthing environments help reduce C-sections and promoted healthier deliveries, helped reduce postpartum depression, etc. I haven't looked it up. Are there science that demonstrate that death doulas in fact help diminish the use of pain medicines and help people deal with grief better? Is there actual science out there? Have you seen it?
Anecdotally, I think we do know it's true, but I do not know of any studies yet that have been published. I was part of a study that was conducted by a university in the South a few years ago. So I know there are people that are trying to codify and qualify and quantify the actual effect of working with doulas and what else that means, because it's almost like saying, oh, I would like to work with a death doula. Think about that with a birth doula. There are many other things that come into play over the course of the pregnancy. You're working with a medical team. You have caregiver circle. You have the doula you're working with. You may even have a midwife. So it can be that nuanced as well, working with a circle of care. Often the doula can be part of, with hospice, the nurse will be the head of the care plan for the dying person on the medical side. The doula can be the head of the care plan to hold space for everything else and incorporate that medical plan into the greater care plan to deal with the whole being.
I love that you say it as you just did, because what I'm envisioning is this, perfect pairing of the medications that can assist people in feeling less discomfort and pain while dying, but coupled with the rituals. And I think part of why I wanted you to come on and talk to us today, Karen, was I feel like we have moved so far away from rituals in our lives. And maybe more in this country than in others. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert in rituals, but I do believe that particularly young people who are so involved with the internet and now AI, that they've moved so far away from ritual. And I'm wondering, are young people getting involved with this movement as well?
Oh, I think so much so.
Yeah.
It's extremely hopeful because I think that just statistically, people who are in their 30s having children now, they're being pressed on both sides in terms of caregiving. So they need help with caregiving in raising their families because most people need to be a 2-income family to survive. And then they've got their elders, their parents, maybe their grandparents even still alive. And the medical structure is crumbling underneath us. So they are very aware that we need to find a different model.
Yeah.
To care for ourselves, our lives, and in our deaths.
I'm so glad, because it's not only supporting the movement to embrace death and dying more in our lives and understanding it, but it's also giving these young people a structure, a community, a way in which to explore these big questions that is loving and supportive and creative and asking questions. And that's so important.
Bringing it back to something you said earlier, you said light and dark, which really is a beautiful way to express the totality of our existences. From moment to moment, it can never be all light. And again, this brings it back to being a photographer and a filmmaker for me, because the alchemy of light is just magic. It's pure magic.
Yes.
And we are that as well. We are that alchemy. Mm-hmm. There is a dark side to existence. And if we ignore that throughout our lives, it's very difficult for us to let in the shadow side of things that occur for us when we're dying, because this is a reality. This is not something that a lot of people want to think about, but when they're dying, it's there.
Yeah.
And they have to address it. So it's so interesting just in terms of the storytelling aspect of our existences. We all have our stories. We also have something different, which is our narrative. All of these things start to fall away. And the true essence of who we are becomes much more prominent and palpable as we're making our way out of this lifetime. There is profound beauty in that. And so I just want to say, to encourage people to not be afraid to look at the non-duality of light and darkness in our existence, and to think about how that might play out in our everyday lives as well. How that relates to grief, even. There's a beautiful quote that I love to say, which is that grief and love are like a kudzu vine. You know, you cannot experience love without experiencing grief. And if you experience grief, you know you have loved. This is part of the sum total of our existence.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a wonderful place to bring us to a close. But I like to ask my guests, when you're not doing the work that you're doing, and you've already intimated what you do that gives you pleasure, but tell us out loud, what do you do that brings you joy?
Aimless wandering.
I like that. I like that.
I love to walk. I love to hike. And Iyengar yoga is a big part of my existence. And gardening is becoming a big part of my existence, too. I love having my hands in the soil and watching the nature on my land. Right now, we've been visited by this enormous gray heron that comes every spring. And we have an eagle. So the birds have really been keeping me very occupied.
Great. So just one parting thought for those who are listening. Life and death is complex. We don't expect that this is an easy conversation. Take it step by step. Seek out help from folks like Karen who can help you look at just question by question. And that's okay. And there will be fear, and there will be sadness, and there will be grief. These are all a very natural part of our lives and our deaths. So Karen, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And thank you to Jen Hammoud and Matty Rosenberg and the Epicurean for helping Gynocurious be in existence. Until our next episode, be well, and remember to listen to your instincts and intuitions. They are the greatest of teachers, not to be ignored.